She was 52, divorced, and terrified of starting over, not because she was weak, but because she had forgotten who she was without him. At 52, the house felt louder than ever, not because someone was shouting, not because doors were slamming, but because of the silence. For 27 years, she had been someone's wife. Before that, someone's daughter, someone's sister, someone's mother. But now, sitting alone at the kitchen table with divorce papers neatly folded beside her coffee mug, she realized something frightening. She didn't know who she was anymore. The divorce hadn't been dramatic. No public scandal, no screaming matches, no explosive betrayal. Just distance. Slow, quiet, emotional distance. They had stopped talking about dreams, stopped laughing at the same things, stopped touching each other with intention. And one day, they both understood what neither wanted to admit. They were living together, but not living together. When the papers were finally signed, she expected to feel anger, or relief, or maybe even freedom. Instead, she felt empty. For weeks, she woke up automatically at 6:30 a.m., out of habit. She would start making 2 cups of coffee before remembering there was only one person in the house now. She would catch herself thinking, what would he prefer? Should I ask him? Maybe he'll call. But he didn't. And slowly, reality settled in. This wasn't temporary. This wasn't a rough patch. This was the end of the life she had known for nearly 3 decades. Her children were grown, busy building their own lives. Friends tried to be supportive. You're strong. You'll be fine. It's a new beginning. But strength didn't feel real at 2 a.m., when the house was quiet, when the bed felt too big, when memories replayed without permission. She wasn't just grieving a marriage. She was grieving an identity. For years, she had adjusted herself to keep peace, compromised preferences, silenced frustrations, postponed personal dreams. She told herself that was love. But now, sitting alone in the same kitchen where she had once planned family vacations and birthday dinners, she began to ask a question she had avoided for years. When did I disappear? Divorce at 52 wasn't just about losing a partner. It felt like losing direction. Who dates at this age? Who starts over? Who rebuilds from scratch when everyone else seems settled? The fear wasn't about money. It wasn't about survival. It was about relevance. Would anyone ever look at her the same way again? Would she ever feel chosen? Or had her best years quietly slipped away without her noticing? One afternoon, she stood in front of the bathroom mirror longer than usual, not fixing her hair, not adjusting makeup, just looking, really looking. There were fine lines near her eyes now, softness in places that hadn't been there in her 20s. But there was something else too, strength. She had raised children, managed a household, supported a husband's career, handled crises no one else even knew about. And suddenly, a thought crossed her mind. If I carried everyone else for years, why do I think I can't carry myself? It wasn't a dramatic breakthrough. There was no music playing in the background, no inspirational speech, just a quiet shift. That night, instead of scrolling through old photos, she opened a notebook, and for the first time in years, she wrote something that wasn't a grocery list. She wrote, "What do I want?" The question felt unfamiliar, almost selfish, but she kept writing. She wanted peace. She wanted stability. She wanted to feel confident walking into a room alone. She wanted financial independence. She wanted to stop apologizing for taking up space. She didn't want revenge. She didn't want to prove anything to her ex-husband. She just wanted to feel like herself again. The next morning, she did something small but powerful. She rearranged the living room, not because it needed changing, but because she did. She moved the couch, changed the artwork, cleared out items that carried emotional weight. It wasn't about furniture. It was about reclaiming space. Days turned into weeks. She signed up for a class she had once considered years ago, but dismissed as impractical. She started walking every evening, not to lose weight, but to clear her mind. At first, people saw a divorced woman starting over, but she was beginning to see something different. She wasn't broken. She was rebuilding. Divorce at 52 didn't mean life was over. It meant the script had changed, and for the first time in decades, she was holding the pen. The first real fear didn't come from loneliness. It came from numbers. One evening, she sat at the dining table with her laptop open and a small notebook beside her. Bills were neatly stacked. Bank statements were highlighted. Her glasses rested low on her nose as she studied the screen. For years, she hadn't worried about these details, not because she wasn't capable, but because she had trusted him to handle it. Now, every payment, every decision, every financial responsibility carried her name alone, and that felt heavy. Her heart raced slightly as she calculated monthly expenses: mortgage, insurance, utilities, groceries, car payment. She wasn't in danger. She wasn't struggling, but the responsibility felt unfamiliar. For the first time in decades, there was no one to double-check with, no one to say, "What do you think?" The decision was hers, all of it. She closed the laptop slowly. The house felt quiet again. But this time, the silence didn't feel empty. It felt expectant, as if life was waiting for her to decide what came next. The next morning, she drove past a small business training center she had noticed before but never entered. Years ago, she had once dreamed of starting something of her own: a consulting service, a small boutique, even an online business. But those dreams had been gently folded away when practicality took priority. Now, sitting at a red light, she heard a thought she hadn't allowed in years. What if I try? Her immediate reaction was fear. I'm too old, the market is different now, who would take me seriously? What if I fail? Failure at 25 feels like experience. Failure at 52 feels like humiliation. At least that's what she had been taught to believe. That afternoon, she walked into the training center. Her palms were slightly sweaty. The receptionist smiled warmly. "Can I help you?" For a moment, she almost turned around, almost said she was just looking, almost returned to the safety of her car. But something stopped her. "I'd like information about your small business program," she said calmly. Her voice didn't shake. That surprised her. The woman behind the desk handed her a brochure and began explaining options: flexible schedules, online modules, mentorship programs. She listened carefully, not as someone desperate, but as someone curious. Driving home, brochure resting on the passenger seat, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: possibility. Not because she had signed up, not because she had made a big announcement, but because she had walked through the door. That evening, self-doubt returned. It always does. What if this is unrealistic? Should I just focus on enjoying quiet retirement? Maybe I'm trying too hard. She made tea and sat near the window. Outside, the street was calm. Inside, her thoughts weren't. For years, she had been the supportive one, encouraging, reassuring, believing in others. Now she realized something uncomfortable. She had never learned how to believe in herself. The next week, she attended the orientation session. Most of the room was younger, late 20s, early 30s, ambitious energy, quick typing, fast conversations. For a moment, she felt invisible again, out of place. But then the instructor asked a question.
Who here has real-life experience managing people, budgets, and long-term responsibilities? She slowly raised her hand. So did two others. The instructor smiled. "Experience is currency," he said. "Don't underestimate it." That sentence stayed with her. Experience is currency. She wasn't behind. She wasn't outdated. She was seasoned. And that mattered. Weeks passed. She learned new systems, digital marketing basics, online payment platforms, modern communication tools. Some evenings were frustrating. She clicked the wrong buttons, forgot passwords, mixed up processes. Once, she even cried quietly in the kitchen after struggling with a website builder. Not because she couldn't learn, but because she hated feeling incompetent. Then she caught herself. Hadn't she once taught her children how to walk?
Hadn't she once balanced family finances during tough years? Hadn't she supported her husband's career moves without complaint? Why was she suddenly acting like she had no resilience? She wiped her tears, reopened the laptop, tried again. Not perfectly, but persistently. And slowly, something powerful began to shift. She stopped introducing herself as, "I'm divorced." She started saying, "I'm building something new." The words felt different, stronger. One afternoon, she met an old friend for coffee. "How are you really doing?" her friend asked gently. She paused, then answered honestly. "I was scared," she admitted, "but I'm starting to feel capable." Capable. That word carried weight. Because strength isn't loud. It isn't dramatic. It doesn't announce itself. It builds quietly, through small decisions, through uncomfortable steps, through showing up even when doubt whispers loudly. One evening, after finishing another training module, she stood in front of the same bathroom mirror she had faced weeks earlier. This time, she didn't search for loss. She searched for growth, and she saw it. Not in her appearance, but in her posture. Her shoulders were straighter, her gaze steadier. Divorce had shaken her foundation, but it hadn't destroyed her structure. In fact, it had revealed something she had forgotten. She was not dependent. She was adaptable. She wasn't weak. She was evolving. And for the first time since signing those papers, she felt something stronger than fear. She felt momentum.
The first payment wasn't large. It wasn't life-changing. It didn't make headlines. But when the notification appeared on her phone, "You've received a payment," her hands froze for a moment. She stared at the screen longer than necessary. It wasn't about the money. It was about proof. Proof that she could create something on her own. Proof that her skills had value. Proof that starting at 52 wasn't foolish. She sat down slowly on the couch, phone still in her hand. For years, income had come into her life through shared accounts, joint decisions, combined efforts. Now this was different. This was hers. Not because she needed independence to compete with anyone, but because she needed independence to remember herself. She whispered something softly to the empty room. "I did this." And for the first time since the divorce, the silence answered back, not with loneliness, but with pride. Momentum changes everything. Once she saw that one small result, her energy shifted. She worked more intentionally, not obsessively, not desperately, but with quiet discipline. Mornings became structured. Coffee, walk, laptop open by 9 a.m. Evenings were calmer. No more replaying old conversations in her head. No more wondering what she could have done differently. Because her mind had new space to occupy. Purpose leaves little room for regret. One afternoon, her daughter visited unexpectedly. She walked into the house, looked around, and paused. "Mom, something feels different here." She smiled. "Does it?" "It feels lighter." Her daughter wasn't talking about furniture. She was talking about energy. For years, her mother had carried invisible tension, trying to keep peace, trying to maintain stability, trying to hold everything together. Now, there was no pretending. There was no walking carefully around someone else's moods. There was just honesty and growth. Her daughter sat down at the kitchen table. "I'm proud of you," she said quietly. The words hit deeper than expected, because pride used to be something she directed outward, toward her children, toward her husband, toward friends, but rarely toward herself. That night, after her daughter left, she reflected on something unexpected. The divorce hadn't just changed her life. It had changed how others saw her, not as someone who failed, but as someone who chose courage. Of course, not everyone was supportive. At a small gathering weeks later, an old acquaintance leaned in and asked, "So, are you lonely?" The question carried subtle judgment, as if being alone automatically meant being incomplete. She didn't react defensively. She didn't over-explain. She simply smiled. "I'm peaceful," she replied. And that was true. Loneliness had been louder when she was married and emotionally disconnected. Now, solitude felt different. It felt chosen. It felt powerful. There is a difference between being alone and belonging to yourself. She was beginning to understand that. Her business continued to grow slowly. One client became two. Two became four. Nothing explosive, nothing dramatic, just steady progress. And with each small success, her posture changed a little more. She stopped introducing herself as someone who used to be married. She stopped framing her story around what ended. Instead, she talked about what she was building, And people noticed. Confidence at 52 doesn't look like confidence at 25. It's not loud, it's not flashy, it doesn't seek validation. It feels grounded, earned, real. One evening, she found an old photo album tucked in a drawer. Wedding pictures, family vacations, holiday gatherings. She sat on the floor flipping through memories. There was no anger now, no bitterness, just acknowledgement. That chapter had existed. It had taught her things. It had shaped her. But it no longer defined her. She closed the album gently and returned it to the drawer. Not because she wanted to erase the past, but because she no longer lived there. Growth is quiet like that. It doesn't scream. It simply shifts your center. Weeks later, something unexpected happened. Her ex-husband called. Nothing dramatic, just logistical questions about paperwork. But hearing his voice didn't shake her the way it once had. She answered calmly, spoke clearly, ended the call politely. And when she hung up, there were no tears, no spiraling thoughts, no emotional collapse, just neutrality. And neutrality felt like freedom, because emotional independence is stronger than financial independence. It means your peace is no longer attached to someone else's presence. That night, she stood once again in front of the bathroom mirror. But this time, she wasn't searching. She was recognizing. The woman staring back at her was not broken, not abandoned, not too old. She was experienced, resilient, capable. Divorce at 52 had felt like the end, but it had actually been an unveiling. For years, she had supported someone else's growth. Now she was supporting her own. And that realization didn't just make her stronger, it made her free. For the first time in decades, she wasn't living to maintain something. She was living to create something. And creation is powerful, because when you build something with your own hands, your confidence doesn't depend on anyone else staying. She turned off the bathroom light and walked back into the living room. The house was still quiet, but it no longer felt empty. It felt intentional. And she realized something deeply important. She hadn't just survived divorce. She had outgrown it. Strength becomes visible the moment you stop defending yourself. And she had stopped defending herself. But the world hadn't stopped questioning her. At a neighborhood gathering one Saturday evening, she walked in wearing a simple navy dress. Nothing dramatic, nothing attention-seeking, just confident. Yet she could feel the glances. Not cruel, not openly judgmental, but curious. Divorce at 52 makes people uncomfortable because it forces them to imagine starting over, and most people would rather stay comfortable than imagine courage. She overheard whispers. Poor thing. Must be hard at this age. Do you think she'll remarry? Years ago, those words would have hurt. Now, they felt distant, because their assumptions no longer matched her reality. When someone finally asked directly, "So, how are you really doing?" there was an undertone in the question, as if they expected sadness or regret. She smiled calmly. "I'm doing better than I thought I would." And she meant it. Later that night, driving home under soft streetlights, she reflected on something powerful. People often confuse comfort with happiness. Her marriage had been comfortable, predictable, structured, but comfort had slowly replaced connection, and stability had slowly replaced growth. She hadn't left chaos. She had left stagnation. That difference mattered. The following week, something unexpected happened. A man at her business networking event asked if she'd like to continue their conversation over coffee sometime. The invitation wasn't flirtatious, it wasn't pushy, it was simple, respectful. Her immediate reaction wasn't excitement, it was hesitation. Dating at 52? The thought felt foreign. For decades, she hadn't introduced herself as an individual woman. She had introduced herself as someone's wife. Now she was just herself. And that felt both empowering and vulnerable. That night, she stood in front of her mirror again, not searching for flaws, not adjusting appearance, just asking herself one honest question. Am I afraid because I'm not ready or because I've grown? There's a difference. Fear rooted in insecurity says, I'm not enough. Fear rooted in growth says, I refuse to shrink. And she realized something clearly. She wasn't afraid of being alone. She was afraid of losing her new peace. That awareness changed everything. Because now, any future connection would have to add to her life, not replace her identity, not consume her energy, not demand silence. If someone entered her world again, it would be as a partner, not as a dependency. And that realization made her stronger than she had ever been in her 20s. She didn't say yes immediately. She didn't say no either. She allowed herself space. For the first time in her life, she didn't feel pressure to rush into anything. Not to prove she was still desirable, not to prove she had moved on, not to satisfy society's timeline. She was no longer performing for approval. She was living intentionally. Weeks later, sitting alone on her porch one quiet Sunday afternoon, she reflected on the woman she had been 3 years earlier.
That woman had avoided conflict, avoided change, avoided disappointment. She had tolerated emotional distance because stability felt safer than uncertainty. But now she understood something deeply powerful. Uncertainty is uncomfortable, but stagnation is dangerous. Because stagnation slowly erases who you are, and she refused to disappear again. The true breakthrough didn't happen at a networking event. It didn't happen during a business win. It didn't even happen during a romantic invitation. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday morning. She was walking through her neighborhood, sunlight filtering through trees, when she felt it. Peace. Not forced positivity, not temporary excitement. Deep, grounded peace. She wasn't rushing anywhere. She wasn't chasing validation. She wasn't replaying old arguments in her head. She was simply present. And she realized something that felt almost shocking. Divorce hadn't ruined her life. It had redirected it. The pain had been real. The fear had been real. The sleepless nights had been real. But so was this strength. So was this clarity. So was this independence. And suddenly, the narrative shifted in her mind. She wasn't a woman who had been left. She was a woman who had chosen growth. That subtle difference changed her entire identity.
This time, she wrote something different. I trust myself. 4 simple words, but they carry decades of evolution. Trusting yourself means you believe your instincts, you respect your boundaries, you accept your worth, you walk away when necessary, you stay when it aligns. Trusting yourself means you no longer need someone else to confirm your value, and that is powerful at any age. But at 52, it is revolutionary. She looked around her home that night, not with sadness, not with nostalgia, but with ownership. This wasn't a house she was surviving in. It was a life she was building in. And for the first time, the future didn't feel frightening. It felt open. There comes a moment in rebuilding your life when you stop measuring time by what you lost and start measuring it by what you've gained. For her, that moment didn't arrive with fireworks. It came quietly, on an ordinary morning. She was standing in her kitchen, sunlight pouring through the window, coffee brewing softly in the background. 3 years ago, this same kitchen had felt like a reminder of everything that ended. Now, it felt like a foundation, not of a marriage, but of herself. She leaned against the counter and realized something almost unbelievable. She was no longer angry. Not at him, not at herself, not at the past. The resentment had dissolved into understanding. They hadn't failed, they had simply finished. And endings are not always tragedies. Sometimes they are transitions. Her business had grown steadily. Nothing glamorous, nothing viral, but stable. Clients trusted her. They valued her experience. They respected her boundaries. And most importantly, she respected herself. Financial independence had once felt like survival. Now it felt like confidence, because earning your own stability changes how you walk into a room. You don't enter hoping to be accepted. You enter knowing you belong. A few months later, she did meet someone. Not in a dramatic, cinematic way, not through a whirlwind romance, just a simple dinner. Conversation flowed naturally. There was no need to impress, no need to hide, no need to shrink. And that's when she realized something profound. She no longer needed love to complete her. She only wanted love that complemented her. That difference changes everything, because when you don't need saving, you stop choosing saviors. You start choosing equals. But even if that dinner had never happened, even if romance had never returned, she would still be whole. That was the real victory. At 52, she thought divorce meant starting from zero, but she hadn't started from zero. She had started from experience, from wisdom, from resilience, from decades of understanding what she would never tolerate again. Starting over doesn't erase who you are, it reveals who you've become. One evening, she found herself walking past an old photo studio downtown. On impulse, she stepped inside. She booked a simple portrait session, not for social media, not for dating apps, not to prove anything, just for herself. A week later, she stood in front of the camera. No heavy makeup, no dramatic poses, just her. The photographer said gently, "Relax, be yourself." She smiled. "I am." And for the first time in her life, she meant it. When she saw the finished portrait, she didn't see a divorced woman. She didn't see someone abandoned. She didn't see age as limitation. She saw strength in her eyes, calm in her posture, freedom in her expression. She saw a woman who had survived uncertainty and chosen growth anyway. The biggest transformation wasn't visible in photos. It was visible in her decisions. She no longer explained herself unnecessarily. She no longer stayed where she felt unseen. She no longer tolerated emotional distance just to avoid loneliness. She understood something most people learn too late. Peace is more valuable than partnership. Self-respect is more powerful than validation. And independence is not isolation. It is ownership. Years ago, she had feared one question more than anything. What will people think? Now she asked a better one. What do I think? That shift changed her life. Because once you trust your own voice, the world's opinions lose volume. On the anniversary of her divorce, she didn't cry. She didn't feel regret. She didn't replay memories. Instead, she did something symbolic. She took a long drive. Windows down, music playing softly. Not because she was escaping, but because she was celebrating. Not the end of a marriage, but the beginning of her autonomy. At a red light, she caught her reflection in the rearview mirror. 3 years ago, that reflection had looked uncertain. Today, it looked steady, grounded, confident. She smiled at herself. Not because everything was perfect, but because she knew something powerful. She could handle imperfection. Divorce at 52 had once sounded like a headline of failure. Now it sounded like a chapter title, and the book was still being written. By her, for her. That evening, as the sun set behind her home, she stood by the window, the same window where she once questioned her worth, the same house where silence once felt heavy. Now the silence felt peaceful, intentional, chosen. She whispered something softly, almost like a promise. I didn't lose my life. I found it. And in that quiet moment, she understood the full truth. Strength isn't about never falling. It's about standing up without bitterness. Independence isn't about being alone. It's about being aligned. And starting over after 50 isn't a setback. It's a second beginning.